Hi guys, my name's John, and today I'm going to talk through my perspective on positioning and why I think it's really, really important. And I'll start with a kind of general overview with some hints and tips, and then finish by discussing the nuances of positioning climate tech products specifically. So let's start by defining what positioning actually is to start with. So simply put, positioning is the way people talk about your solution and the value it can generate. So contrary to popular belief, it's not necessarily the tagline that goes on your homepage. It looks more like the way a customer explains your software to a colleague, or perhaps the way an employee describes the company they work for to their parents, for example. It's these sorts of situations that really reveal your true positioning. Now, positioning exists regardless of whether you spend time working on it or not. It's something you can influence and perhaps shape, but you can't outright define it. It's worth spending time to really understand your positioning because it shapes everything else. Brand, culture, strategy, operations all suffer if positioning isn't well understood across the company. But in my opinion, the most important thing to understand about positioning, and certainly the most misunderstood, is that it only exists in the mind of the customer. So it's a little bit convoluted and pedantic, but whenever you're trying to work on your positioning, you're attempting to understand how people already think of your solution and then lean into that. So what does good positioning look like? For me, it comes down to 4 key characteristics. Firstly, it must align with a well understood and widely accepted product category. So don't try to create a new category, however exciting it might be, unless there's no other option, and it truly is. It does deserve that. Second is it must clearly address the pain points of an underserved market segment. It should enable customers to make trade-offs by making it clear what it can and cannot do. This is crucial for buyers to be able to make purchasing decisions. It's not just about the good; it's also understanding that key trade-off there. And finally, it must carve out a big enough portion of the market that it can dominate. So big enough is, of course, subjective, but it can be tempting to want to play in the big league when you'd be far better off playing a game you can win. So just to ram that point home, be a big fish in a small pond. This is often talked about as finding a niche. Don't give in to temptations. You can expand later on. You'll learn far more by serving a smaller group of customers who love what you have to offer. So next, let's look at kind of like how to actually do positioning, if you like. So it comes down to 3 key questions. It's worth repeating though. The goal is to observe what is already true, not try and create something new, exciting, and fictitious. So the first question is, what is it? In real terms, what have you actually built? This can be summed up beautifully by the terrible cliche: if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck. Don't fool yourself. Call it as it is. This isn't the time to confuse your customers with fancy aspirational buzzwords that they don't understand. Kind of in my industry, you see there's a lot in the kind of smart building, IoT, AI, machine learning, digital twin nonsense that a lot of people throw around without much context. The second question is, who is it for? Now, the problem here is that most climate tech products are relevant to almost everyone, and we want them to be, widely adopted. But this isn't particularly helpful when it comes to positioning. You want to speak to a specific group of customers with a specific pain point who recognize themselves in your message. And finally, how does it solve the problem? So this is where you can provide your own spin on the situation. In essence, it's your USP or differentiator, but try to give it some context. Don't be afraid to be opinionated and risk alienating a portion of the market. It means you can resonate strongly with your perfect customer. But don't use terms like the only or the first unless it's actually objectively true. See this far too often. So in practice, it looks something like this very basic fill in the blank template. I've triggered Siri now as well. It looks very like this basic fill in the blank template. There are more complicated versions of this, but they all revolve around the same concept. positioning looks super simple on the surface, but it's often the simplicity of the statement that makes it so difficult. So vague positioning is very straightforward to do. Doing it well requires you to, ask some really difficult questions and make some tough decisions. So spending a lot of time on those 3 questions from the previous slide are, that's what's going to make the difference. So just to kind of summarize that point, positioning isn't about better or worse products. It's not about fighting for a place in a league table or taking on your competitors head to head. The only thing that matters is context. You don't have to be bigger or better to win, which I think is importantly relevant in the startup space, but you just have to be relevant to a big enough subset of the market. So I'll finish by looking at some considerations when thinking about positioning climate tech products specifically. A question I ask myself quite a lot is, are we building products for customers or for the planet? So I think the answer is both, and this can make things really difficult from a positioning perspective. How do you convey the positive impact of your product whilst also being relevant to customers today? I think there's an opportunity to strike a balance, but it's certainly not straightforward. Over the last few years, there have been so many new entrants to the market. A lot of them are just jumping on the bandwagon. Combine this with the fact that customers are generally pretty underinformed and the need for well-positioned products becomes so much more important. And just one final point before I finish. I've taken this visual from a book by April Dunford on positioning, which is very, very good. I highly recommend it. And I've adapted it slightly for kind of our specific situation. But the diagram illustrates the importance of positioning your product or service at the intersection of an industry trend to start with, so whether that be ESG, net zero, waste, etc., a genuine customer pain point, so not something they want to do, but something they need to do right now, a problem that's kind of keeping them up at night, if you like. And of course, your solution. So again, not the product you'd like to build in 10 years, or perhaps the one you wish you'd built, but what you actually have right now and the tangible value it offers. So the areas of the diagram where a section is missing quite nicely illustrates the typical positioning pitfalls. So on the left-hand side, you've got an exciting product, but without a clear pain point to resolve. So it might sound cool and attract technology enthusiasts and the typical early adopters, but it will appear confusing to the mass market because it just doesn't solve a problem they can relate to. On the right-hand side, you've got a terrible but frequently used positioning technique. Far too many companies position themselves as the answer to a huge industry problem that seamlessly solves a customer pain point, but unfortunately, they don't have the product to back it up. And finally, see this a lot in more traditional areas of the market, things like utility invoicing and energy management and stuff like that. But you've got mature products that have a solid solution that solves a really specific problem, but they fail to align it with industry trend and then appear completely irrelevant to the market when they've actually got quite a lot to offer. So yeah, that's it from me. Thanks very much for listening. We'll maybe catch up in the breakout sessions in a sec.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was full of really, really interesting content. And I've just popped that book recommendation in the chat. So if any of you wanted to follow up and get a copy of that, I've put the name and the author in the chat. I hope I've done it right. Check, Jonathan, make sure I've spelled it right. But yeah, so that was excellent. And particularly love that bit about not trying to be all things to all people, but knowing who your market is, knowing who your niche is and being really relevant to them. So that was really great. Dan, if you'd like to share with us your sides.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Right, let's see if the screen share works. Can everybody see that? Yeah. Cool. So I'm Dan. I'm the CEO and founder of MyMotherTree.com. Lovely to sort of meet you all, see you, and Cherry, thanks so much for the intro. So a very, very quick bit about me. So that's me, part-time climber, part-time geek, pretty happy Arsenal fan at this point. I live in Slovakia. So my wife's a Slovak. We were living in London. We moved out there during lockdown. Like, one of the only silver linings of COVID was suddenly we weren't bound by the office, and so found out she was pregnant, and we went out there. So that's her and my son. There they are. So either as a founder or part of a founding team, I've been part of 4 startups. So the first was OVO Communities. So this was a spin out of OVO Energy. We created local energy companies built on OVO Energy's trading platform. So that meant local employment, local generation, built that into a £7 million revenue business per year, and was really my first foray into the startup world. And that gave me a taste of the entrepreneurial life. So I left that to start Good Company. Good Company was originally a social business, but became a charity, which actually unlocked about £500,000 of funding. What we did was we connected volunteers with elderly people in their area. And this business failed. We didn't hit the targets we set out to achieve. We ended up closing it after about 18 months and giving back 95% of the funding, which is pretty rare for a charity. Normally sort of run that funding into the ground and walk away. And we had I certainly had 2 major lessons in this. And I think lots of the sort of best lessons do tend to happen in the failures. The first was I was really shit scared of failure when I ran this. But actually when it failed, it felt like a relief. It was kind of a realization that it's okay to fail. And yeah, there were tears, but ultimately it was just a bruised ego. No one got hurt, no one died. And actually got to face that fear, that sort of fear of failure for the first time. The second thing was to really find your purpose. So for me, pretty early on in that business, I realized it wasn't about solving loneliness. And while testing Good Company, or while testing our idea, I met a 95-year-old chap at a lunch club who had the most energy, the most sort of life sort of force that I've come across. I had to ask him, what's your secret? And he said it's simply to help others. So he was there at that lunch club to meet with his friend who had Alzheimer's. That friend would likely not remember him, but for him, it was important to be by his side every Wednesday. On Thursdays, he was helping out at the charity shop, and on Fridays at the bowls club. His thing was literally to help others, and that's really stayed with me. So in July 2017, I then joined Look After My Bills on their founding team. It's also known as LAM, is the acronym. So if I slip between the two, then you'll know what I'm talking about. The idea of Look After My Bills was to automatically switch your energy whenever your bills went up. So we'd switch you to a cheaper provider. We were Y Combinator backed in early 2018, and we got the best ever deal on Dragon's Den that same year. It remains the best ever deal in terms of equity to money raised, I think. And in 2019, we sold that company to Go Compare. So them of the really annoying opera singer. Lots of stories about him if we ever grab a beer together. And last year I left that and with Look After My Bills, just shy of 1 million customers. So having had some time out after Look After My Bills, and with the birth of my son Theo, I really had a chance to think about what was my purpose. And when I sort of first held my son, I kind of made him the promise that I would do all I could to make sure he grows up in a world he deserves. And for me, that translates as to how we can help with the climate crisis, which has led me to MotherTree. So MotherTree, our mission is to make it effortless for you to go green across all parts of your life. And our goal is to get £1 billion into the green economy within 3 years. So we do that by focusing on finances first, because that has the biggest impact, both in terms of you, in terms of the carbon that it can save, but it also in terms of the choice of where we put our money and the future that can actually create. To put that in perspective, so Barclays currently put £19 billion into fossil fuels a year. The UK pension market is worth about 3 trillion. Anywhere between 2 and 10% of that money is going to fossil fuel. So we're talking about sort of really big amounts. And when you think half the money in the world is actually in pensions, it's a real chance to influence the kind of society we want to build. And so MotherTree exists to make that more transparent. The first thing we do is we calculate the carbon impact of your money. So for instance, if you have £1,000 in the current account with Barclays, that translates to about 0.5 ton of carbon per year going in per year. And that's based on how Barclays invest. And then the second thing MotherTree does, and Cherry mentioned it earlier, is we introduce you to green providers. So banks like Readouts, who never invest in fossil fuels, and impact investors like The Path, who make sure your money's going towards places that are genuinely good for the planet. So when Sherry asked me to put together a slide on product, and you can probably tell I haven't used a slide deck in years, so this is unbelievably basic compared to John's. I wasn't really sure what to focus on in terms of, is it templates, etc. But I thought I'd just pick out the sort of 3, and it became 3.5 principles of building startup products. So the first one for me is put the customer at the center of your thinking. And this sort of came, one way I've sort of picked this up is from Jeff Bezos, and you might have heard this one, but he made sure in every single meeting room in at Amazon, there was a free chair. So every single meeting, there was an empty chair, and that represented the customer. And we really tried to embrace that at Look After My Bills, especially in the early days of that company when we were still figuring out the really big questions around revenue and marketing. So at the very start of that sort of journey, I set up a landing page with a series of spreadsheets on the back where we could just manage customer switches going to providers. And it meant we could get a product to market really quickly without having to solve, like, where's the money going to come from straight away? And how are we actually going to market this to a bigger audience? We've got 10 customers onto that landing page and actually onto those spreadsheets. And I went to their homes to observe them going through that experience. Like, it was a really, it was kind of nerve-wracking, but also an unbelievably important stage. So we gleaned so many insights from that. The first was a real grounding of who our customers were and who they weren't. These were people who had switched energy provider before, realized it really isn't rocket science, but could not be asked to do it every year. And it was really clear early on, and being in those homes, that these were not the sort of spreadsheet warriors that were, tracking every single change in the energy price. The other thing that was so clear by just sitting with customers and watching them go through the website was where there were real issues with conversion. Like, I literally sat there and watched someone get up from his desk and go and rifle through his bills for the energy details, and we couldn't let that happen. That was just such an easy place for people to drop off. The next thing I did for the next 300 customers was I gave every single one of them my mobile number, not my actual phone, my mobile number. And I said, call me day or night if something goes wrong. And for me, this was really important because suddenly, if there was something wrong with the experience, I'd hear about it almost instantly. And I knew if I didn't solve that, then I was going to get snowballed with customer calls, and that's all I'd be able to do that day. So it was a real sort of rocket to make sure I was focused on the customer experience at that point. And I'm trying to do that at MotherTree as well. So I run something called the Climate Challenge, where we go over a week. Members take on a series of tasks to reduce their carbon footprint and discover ways to live more sustainably. It's great because I hope those people who do it discover ways, ways to just be a little bit more sustainable and reduce their carbon footprint. But for me, it's amazing because I can observe where certain tasks are easier to do, where the blockers are, and how they prioritize going green in their wider life. So quick summary of putting customers at the center of your thinking. The first is, how close can you get to customers, in their home, or are they calling your mobile, especially in that early stage? And then second is, how tight can you make those feedback loops so that when something goes wrong, you're really hearing about it? So second sort of principle or lesson is focus on problems, not solutions. And John alluded to this as well. So this is such a hard lesson for me to learn, and probably the thing I'm still learning. So at Good Company, the charity that I launched, we had an amazing founding team. One of the founders had launched the biggest youth charity in the UK. Great track record, raised $500,000. Pretty quickly, we zeroed in on the problem of loneliness, and we got in a meeting room and came up with the solution. And it didn't look a million miles away from this dreadful stock image. we were excited. We were going to solve the issue of loneliness. And when we put our solution in front of our first target audience, the reception was lukewarm at best. The data pointed to the fact that this idea was a sticking plaster to being lonely. It wasn't going to be a long-term solution. But we persevered and we really tested that idea to destruction. We were sort of locked in on that one solution, and it took us the best part of a year to really realize that this wasn't going to scale to the size that we wanted, that we were really in this sector to do. And so we closed that business down. And for me, the real lesson there is focus on the problem. We could have saved ourselves a whole bunch of time and hassle if we'd simply understood the problem better at the beginning of that process. So quick summary: get real clarity on the problem to be solved before defining the solution. How well can you understand that problem from the customer's perspective? And then use data to nail it. How sort of exact can you make those data points to really underpin that problem, both qualitative and quantitative, which brings me on to lesson 3.5, which is take big swings and track the key data. So absolutely one of my biggest lessons so far has been to get really obsessive about the data, getting really clear about the data points to track. And it really is better to put a few hours thought up front into what they could be than to sort of piece it together later on, adding in extra pieces, because you miss a lot of the picture in terms of what you're trying to deliver. And ultimately, if you're not clear on what your success criteria is, and you're not tracking the data to prove that consistently and ruthlessly, then you really don't know if your building is going to be a success. So having not been very sort of good on the data at Good Company, I was determined to address that at Lamb. And so from week 1, I put in place a metrics dashboard to track everything I possibly could about that company on a weekly basis, and made it available to all employees. And this allowed us to constantly test and also make sure we're all looking at the same problems. We're all looking at the same data that underpins the thing we're trying to solve. So every single thing on that customer journey could be A/B tested, and we could see the results in that metrics dashboard. And arguably, alongside the Dragon's Den appearance, this was ultimately our competitive advantage. There were quite a few other auto switchers in the market when we launched, who had anywhere between 5,000 and 25,000 customers. Some were running the exact same business model as us in terms of, understanding your bill and then switching you. But we were able to handle the really crazy customer volumes of Dragon's Den because we could identify problems and get across them super quickly because we were tracking the data. And by the time Lamb reached 800,000 customers a couple of years ago, the nearest competitor was at 40,000. We didn't offer anything different in terms of the service of auto switching, but we cracked the marketing and we were able to optimize as many touch points as we could through really clear data tracking. So bonus side story, how many Dragon's Den deals do you think actually complete after making the deal on the show? And the answer is less than 50%. Most of them fall through at the audit stage, which takes about 6 weeks from when you sort of secure the deal to when it actually gets shown on TV. And they sent, the Dragons sent in their auditing team, and with the metrics dashboard, we were really able to show what's going on in that business. So we sort of nailed that audit bit as well. And once you know the data that underpins your business, you can start to take really, really big swings. And by that, I mean in terms of testing. So this, you might be wondering who this cricketer is. So the batsman here is a West Indian called Tino Best. And Tino was on the end of one of the best moments of sledging in cricket that I've ever come across. If you don't know what sledging is, it's when the batsman's out at the crease. It's one of the other players just sort of having a word in his ear, saying a joke, just trying to sort of knock him off his focus. And Tino was just tapping at the ball. He wasn't doing anything special. So Freddie Flintoff just said to him, "Mind the windows, Tino," and excuse my awful Lancashire accent. And the next shot, Tino takes a huge swing, misses it, ball hits the stumps, he's out. disastrous from a batting perspective, but brilliant from a startup one. Once you have the right data in place, you can take the really big swings, and it's okay if you fail on those. In fact, it's actually important. Most of those swings should fail. There's a really interesting rumor from Netflix, and I really hope this is true, but they run hundreds of A/B tests every month, fully expecting 99% of them to fail, in the knowledge that if only one works, they will make a huge gain on that metric, like a huge gain on conversion or watching the number of hours watched. And we're not talking about, you know, changing the color of a button or some copy here. It's like changing the entire homepage. These are huge tests. They only need one to be pulled off. So, summary of principle 3, like the 3.5 principle. Use data to define the problem and success metrics. Spend time defining those data points and track them ruthlessly. Get all of that data in one place and share it with the company. And then take big swings, because you never know, you might just 10x one part of your business. Thank you very much. Any questions? Well, I guess we'll be doing questions at the end.
Yeah, we'll do the questions in the breakout. So hold all your questions and you can jump in and ask down there. Thank you so much for that, Dan. Really, really interesting journey, especially that Dragon's Den piece. I'm sure there'll be people that will want to hear and learn more about that from you. But particularly enjoyed that bit about learning those lessons from failure and how important that part of the journey was for you. So thank you so much. Valerio, if you'd like to, no slides from Valerio, just kind of talking, but sharing with you his journey and the lessons.
Yeah, I didn't get the memo on the slides, so I was outdone by my peers. But hopefully my ramblings will be as valuable. But I think one of the things, Cherry, you asked me to talk about was were there any key takeaways from sort of being a product manager and product lead in various tech organizations that sort of scale up and big tech side kind of useful around now that I'm a founder and sort of looking at products in the early stages. The sad thing, I don't know, Sherry, probably you're going to kill me for that, is just the biggest learning was to unlearn almost everything that I had learned throughout that career. And I think that's been the most challenging, exciting part about being a founder today. And so what I'm going to try and do is just put my perspective into what is really different from being in a very large organization that has a lot of funding, time, resources, existing customers, and a lot of luxury. So compared to the scrappiness of being an early stage founder. And I think a lot of this advice really trying to probably relevant for people that are still kind of looking towards product market fit. They're not quite there yet in terms of product market fit. If you're a little bit more mature, perhaps fewer things will apply. So this is really sort of early on, and what does product development can do to help you get to product market fit. I think, so Dan raised a really good point around data, and that's my first one. And I think the biggest truth around startups, especially early on, is that you don't have the luxury of as much data to support your decisions. And so I think that's something that is completely different from big tech. And so it was a big shock for me to adjust to. When I was at Facebook and we had to come up with so I was working on COVID and vaccine misinformation globally across Facebook and Facebook and Instagram. And we had the luxury to be able to see how many people were posting about drinking bleach to cure COVID before understanding what we could do to prevent that from happening further, right? We could slice that data across age groups, across demographics and countries and languages, and whether it was posted as a comment in Facebook or it was on Instagram as a story. Like all of that data, you just don't have it. And so the only thing you're left with really in a startup is kind of, you just have to make assumptions, and you have to make good assumptions, but good enough assumptions, like not perfect assumptions. And the reason you have to make assumptions is so that you can learn as much as possible and just sort of scrap that assumption and move on to the next one. And I think that was a sort of a big shift. And if you think about how big product teams sort of make their decisions, they'll probably have a fancy dashboard and a lot of metrics they're tracking. They can run sort of SQL queries and get all the data they need to make a decision. In a product meeting, in an early stage startup, you don't have that. And so what you can do as a team is just sort of gather around and make a series of sort of credible and sensible assumptions and a plan for how you're going to validate them. And so really the focus is on learning from those assumptions and how applicable they are to what you're doing. And the second piece to that is just truly being nimble enough so that you can pivot. So once you've sort of cleared that assumption is not valid for us, it doesn't apply, or is not true to our market, then move on to the next thing, right? You don't have the luxury to spend time sort of making that assumption work and trying to force on it. Perhaps at Facebook, I could do that. I could spend an entire year doing something that never hit the market, and frankly, probably still be rewarded for it because, you know, as a big company, you can take those risks. In early stage startup, you don't have that. And so every chance is learning, every single piece of data that you can get is critical. So every, like Dan talked about, going to the sort of people's houses, like every sales call you have, that's user testing, right? Every conversation you have with a potential user of the app, that's user testing. Like you can't run user research sessions. Like I can't speak to, right now we're focused a lot on enterprise sales. And I can't call, let's say, the chief sustainability officer of British Airways and say, hey, would you mind if we did some user research with you, right? Nobody will return my call. And so you have to learn how to slide those opportunities to get data and insights out of every chance you get. So that's the first piece that I learned. So no luxury of data. You have to make do with what you get. The second piece is, with the lack of data, what can you do? How do you sort of drive the teams? And I think it's two pieces to it. One is having a clear mission that you're driving towards, right? Like most startups will pivot 100 times. I think I saw the number is probably like 20 times on average before they actually either hit product market fit or die a slow death. And so you don't want to get caught up in that spiral of constant pivoting without having a clear mission that you're working towards, right? That should always be sort of constant, and everybody in the team should be buying into that mission so that they understand that the assumptions that we're making and the things that we're building, we're trying to achieve, are in service of that specific mission. And then whenever you're testing those assumptions that you've made, you need to have one key success metric that you're going to measure sort of whether that assumption is valid or not. Without that, you're just going to have a spiraling of arguments between the teams, within the team members on who's right and who's wrong, because you don't have concrete data to debate, right? So you want to ground it as much as possible in at least one success criteria. And I think, you know, going a little bit later stage, if you have this kind of applies to later stage companies. Like when I was at Monzo and we were sort of, I joined when we're number 20 or something like that. We're very, very early stage, but we had already raised a Series A. We already had like 50,000 customers. And then kind of from there to about 1 million customers, the thing I think set us apart and the reason we were able to grow so successfully, and there's certain sort of reputation of sort of how Monzo does product, is we had teams structured around metrics, not teams structured around product features. And that was incredibly important because the teams then had sort of the liberty and the freedom to explore and test different things, depending on how they thought they could best achieve that metric and the success criteria, not continuously trying to iterate on a specific feature for the sake of doing that and making up success as you go. So first piece was around not having the luxury of data. The second piece is around finding a North Star to drive the team. The third piece is that it's kind of related to the first two, but is as a founder, if any of you are sort of startup founders, you are the gatekeeper to context as much as, and you shouldn't be a custodian of context. I think those are two different things, right? Inevitably, you're going to be exposed to a lot more information than the rest of your team will be, whether it's because you're customer facing all the time, you're speaking to partner, you're speaking to investor, you're chatting to people at industry and conference events. Don't be a custodian of that context. Your job as a founder is to do as much context sharing as possible all the time. And so you don't have the luxury to document, you know, everything all the time, prepare nice presentations internally and give everyone an update. So find those ways throughout your sort of your week, whether it's during stand-ups or planning meetings, to really drop those nuggets of context. So everybody in the team has the same context, can make independent assumptions, can form their own independent views. And that's how you, again, get the whole team to contribute to that assumption-making exercise, right, in the absence of data. the fourth piece then, with all these three things, it makes for like joining an early stage startup. Like we're 12 people. We have 2 engineers and 1 designer right now, and we've been going for a year. And I think it is a really tough gig for anyone to join our team, or any team for that matters. And so you've got to hire people that are comfortable with comfortable with being uncomfortable, that thrive with being uncomfortable and thrive with ambiguity. And that's easier said than done, but it's actually absolutely true. So, you can't have people on the team that sort of need to craft beautiful user stories or jobs to be done or create massive sort of system design documents before actually getting to building. You don't have the luxury of that time. And in most cases, like in our case, we have 1 designer. So there's no sort of design critique that can be done. Like at Facebook, I remember we had 5 designers working in the same area. And so they all did a tiny piece of the design. And so that is just simply not possible. And so you have to find people that are okay with that. And so how do you do that? So what I found works pretty well for me in interview process is really, firstly, discerning based on the journey they've been on, right? There's this sort of popular wisdom that ex-Googles, ex-Facebook, and I'm putting myself in that category, ex-Google, ex-Facebooks are like great hires because they've been at these big tech companies, and that means they're very talented. No, we're not. Like, we're really talented within like our sort of very nice, cushy teams of 20, 30 people, where there is a very structured process for everything to do. Like the translation to, I will be able to crack, it's like a very early stage type of product development. It's very challenging. And so ask people about when they failed, right? How do they talk about their failure? Do they actually get to the root of that? Do they take ownership of that? Are they excited about that? Do they seem to have learned from it? Or do they talk about it negatively? Get to the root of why they want to join a startup, right? Like it shouldn't be for the glory or for saying that you're an early stage startup. And we have the fortunate, like the luck to have been accepted to Y Combinator last year, which means we do get a little bit of more of a reputation when we go into the hiring market, being a Y Combinator company, although in the US is more relevant than in Europe. And so we do get a lot of people sort of, oh, I want to work for a Y Combinator startups because I've heard they're great. Like, it's got to be deeper than that. It's got to be sort of a fundamental will to want to learn and constantly be challenged and be comfortable with that. And I think that's incredibly important. And so, yeah, so I mean, find hackers, like, that's find people that you can just like hack things together. The technical debt is going to be inevitable, and it should not be a sort of a success metric in the short term while you're looking for product market fit. But that gives you a sense of like the kind of people you can hire and bring on the team. The fifth piece is sort of slightly more related, I guess, to those of you who are in the B2B space. And this, for me, coming mostly out of B2C, like at Google, Facebook, and Monzo, this was the biggest learning for me. It's sort of in the B2B world, every customer might have completely different requirements. And so early on, really your objective is to sign as many customers as quickly as possible. It's not going to be to find the customers that fit the product that you've built. And so you're going to have to make compromises. You're going to have to be okay with that. It's just how you learn about the specific requirements that a customer has and how you could replicate that. What is unique about that customer, but also what is replicable about that customer. That means their requirements might reflect other customer requirements. And so there's nothing wrong with actually building bespoke or custom for a client, as long as you learn from it. And the last piece is a bit more of a softer one, but it's something that I've done really badly in the first 6 months, and now I'm putting a lot more emphasis on, which is focusing on building team, building a sense of team. I think, going back to Facebook, every engineer on the team was an IC, was an individual contributor, had their own goals, had their own trajectory, had their own conversations with their manager. Sometimes the manager didn't even sit in the team. And so they all were working almost independent projects. In a startup, you don't have that luxury, right? And so nobody's an individual contributor. Everybody's a team contributor. And the earlier and the quicker you can build that sense of team, manage expectations, be transparent and honest with everyone, the sort of quicker you can get to results. And that's all I have. Sorry, hopefully there were not rumblings or musings of an early stage founder, but happy to chat more about it.
No,
in the
excellent.
breakouts.
Perfect. No, I think really valuable, and I think that first lesson, which is you need to unlearn all the stuff you knew before, is a very valuable one, and hopefully will give some comfort to people who perhaps think, well, you know, I haven't worked for one of the big tech companies, maybe I'm missing something. You've heard it here first. You haven't. So there you go.